Hi, thank you so much for being here. Today, I just wanted to talk about the B Corporation or B Corp movement and discuss their mission and whether this contributes to a biblical vision for ethical practice. I believe this movement should be supported by Christians and non Christians alike because it's steadily reshaping the purpose of business to account for the interests of all stakeholders. And by stakeholders, I mean people or things that are connected to the operations of a company. So that could be employees, communities, or the environment, for example. So we live in a capitalist society, which in a nutshell means that our economic system is based around the private ownership of the means of production and their operation for profit rather than by the state. This means, or this system has allowed certain consumerist practices to be exploitative, unsustainable, and relationally detrimental, whilst also being profitable. I'm sure there are examples of these types of bad practice that pop into our head if we think about news stories that we've seen. So, a couple of examples that jump to my mind are the recent story of Boohoo, the clothing brand, being investigated for modern day slavery after a report found that workers in Leicester were being paid as little as £3.50 an hour. Or there's the Greenpeace campaign that has been campaigning against companies like Nestle, who their use of palm oil has been linked to deforestation and the destruction of habitat for orangutans. Big businesses play a key role in upholding the norm of shareholder primacy. This typically undervalues people and the ecosystems in its pursuit for profit, prioritizing the shareholder effectively. So many consumers and leaders within the business and financial sector are recognizing that our current operations need to change, but more pressure needs to be applied from consumers, companies, and the government for big companies to recognize that it's actually in their long term interest to pay attention to purpose driven movements like B Corps. So the B Corp movement wants to drive change through challenging the viability of shareholder primacy and promote ethical and sustainable practices. But just before I get into what this actually looks like, it's important to acknowledge that the Bible also critiques unjust practices of gaining wealth and proposes purposes of business that go beyond profit. So there are a few similarities that I just want to briefly draw out. I'm not going to be detailing a Christian response to the practices of capitalism. Rather, I'd like to make an argument for why Christians should support B Corps in their efforts to measure and cultivate positive systemic change. In the books of Habakkuk and Isaiah, there are examples of God being critical of those who have gained wealth through unjust means. God assures his people that such gains are short-lived and those who exploit others will not escape judgment. In chapter 2 of Habakkuk, the link between those piling wealth and the consequences that this pursuit has on others and oneself is clear. As in verse 10, it says, "You have plotted the ruin of many peoples, shaming your own house and forfeiting your life." I'd recommend checking out the whole book if you have time. In both Habakkuk and Isaiah, oppressive powers are held accountable for their actions, and they suggest that violence and greed will affect more than just their physical well-being. Their spiritual welfare might also be compromised. So similar critiques are raised in the New Testament as well. James writes of the evil in hoarding wealth and failing to pay workers. He also proposes that businesses should operate with an outward focus, which includes serving the vulnerable. Although there are many differences between the Old Testament, New Testament, and today's societies, work exists throughout time to varied degrees, and so does the opportunity to act righteously and justly and or unjustly and oppressively. Christians should recognize the need and opportunity to act justly towards others through their interactions with businesses, because we are all connected to these operations through things like our jobs or the products that we buy. We need to observe the warnings given around the pursuit of wealth over relationships and acknowledge that unjust gains have an impact on our soul, our relationship with others, and with God. So, also, alternative practices and purposes for business are seen in the commands that God gave ancient Israel, whose economy was actually dependent on its agricultural production. So in Leviticus, leaving the edges of the fields during the harvest season was encouraged as provision for the poor and foreigner living among them. In Ruth, we read how important these practices were for people like Naomi and Ruth to survive, having lost their husbands and therefore their financial provision and social status. Despite our advances in knowledge, technology, and welfare, we still exist in a reality where millions of people need financial assistance. This practice of cordoning off a portion of the profits should become an industry norm. I'm not trying to say that the business sector has the potential to eradicate all material poverty. Rather, I'm trying to suggest that the sector is in a powerful position and has a responsibility to reduce these inequalities and lighten the burden on the welfare state. So the business sector and big multinational corporations especially face a lot of practical hurdles and norms in making lasting progress. So I just wanted to highlight a few of these issues so that we can understand why change is so difficult to implement. So owners of a company tend to lack responsibility to care for stakeholder needs. This can be because companies are often run by directors who may not actually own any of the business or have any long-term interest in the success of the business. These directors are held accountable to shareholders who own the business, but shareholders are preoccupied with profit margins. And so stakeholder interests are squeezed out of the central structure of a company. There's also a perception of shares as a commodity that are to be bought and sold with little regard for the long-term viability of their investment, because investors want quick returns. And when these returns are no longer satisfactory, shares are sold instead of attempting to address the company's problems. This structure leaves stakeholders who are directly affected by the operation and success of a company with little control and provides capital providers with little desire to use their influence on directors towards more ethical and sustainable practices, because again, their focus is on maximizing financial return. So now that I've mentioned a few challenges that movements like B Corp face, I can get into what the B Corp movement actually is and provide a brief comparison with an existing Christian-based business format called the Relational Business Charter. And I'm going to use this to try and demonstrate the ways in which the B Corp movement is aligned with a Christian vision of ethical practice. So, B Corps are businesses that meet the highest standards of verified social and environmental performance, public transparency, and legal accountability. B Lab is a non-profit organisation that measures that measures a company's impact in 5 areas. These are governance, environment, customers, workers, and community. The B Impact Assessment, or BIA, measures these factors within companies. So they've chosen 5 areas to focus on bringing about positive change and have produced a standard by which to measure these areas. The founders of B Lab want to reshape the purpose of business away from shareholder primacy, and B Corps are being used to model a better alternative of profitable business practice, which also has the ambition to promote policy change so that all companies and investors are responsible for the impact of their decisions on all stakeholders and the economic system as a whole. So, as we can see, this is quite an ambition. The Relational Business Charter has been developed by Jonathan Rushworth, a close friend of the Jubilee Centre, and Michael Schluter, the founder of the Jubilee Centre. They see the starting point for evaluation of economic and social institutions as recognising the fact that God is a relational being, and his priority is not economic growth, but right relationships both between humanity and himself and between human beings. When Jesus sets out the overarching moral principles of love God and love your neighbour as yourself, Jesus is emphasizing the priority of relational wealth over financial wealth. The Charter sets out a number of criteria that help build and maintain right relationships with people connected to the operations of a company. This means a relational company will exist for all its stakeholders and not just its investors. So already we can see that the Relational Business Charter's aim and B Corp's mission are similar. So due to time considerations, I'm gonna focus on an aspect of the social and environmental performance pillar of the B Corp movement. This will look at the concerns of workers and compare it with two characteristics in the Relational Business Charter. So these characteristics are highlighted on the screen. And will include ensuring the management have respect for employees' interests and pay differentials are reduced within the company. So the BIA assesses whether a company's employees are financially secure, healthy, both physically and mentally, safe, satisfied, and whether they have opportunities to progress in their career. Under respect for the interests of employees in the Relational Business Charter, companies would be expected to minimize long and unsociable working hours so that they can maintain and build relationships outside of work. Relational companies should also have lower pay differentials to avoid undervaluing people in lower paid jobs. B Lab does not specify avoiding long working hours to be able to certify, but there are examples of B corporations embracing the idea that work should not compromise employees' relationships with others. So for instance, Badger is a company that produces health products. It's a B Corp which values parental influence, and so one of their practices is allowing employees to have a flexible working schedule. This means that parents can attend important events during school hours, so things like school assemblies or sports days. And this has positively impacted employee retention. With regards to pay differentials, people are calling on B Corps to address the issue so that companies can continue to push forward positive change. Again, this is something that certain B Corps are doing, but it's not a requirement. So Namaste Solar is an example of a B Corp that caps the highest salary to its lowest salary at 3:1. And Whole Food Market is another example. And it's also a publicly traded company and a member of the Fortune 500. And they cap their highest paid individual to 19 times that of the average employee salary. So this indicates that the values of the Relational Business Charter and B Corp movement are somewhat aligned, but B Corps do not need to implement these specific practices laid out in the Relational Business Charter because they can do good in other areas relating to workers, which could allow them to reach the benchmark for certification. So B Lab credit various methods and schemes that improve companies' positive social and environmental impact, which they hope will influence the culture of business as a whole. But the Relational Business Charter views right relationships within and between companies as the key to enacting these positive changes. I think there are enough overlaps between the two initiatives to provide a good basis for Christian support for the B Corp movement, and you can read about this further in my report that will be released. This is especially as B Corps are spreading a standard of ethical practice that is picking up traction, and in many cases, B Corps go further than the ideas presented in the Relational Business Charter. The B Corp movement prides itself on continual improvements and supports businesses to do the same. So maybe there is room for a more relationally focused improvements in the future. I just want to move on here and show you a few examples of B corporations that are out there. Hopefully you will recognize at least one of them. And as you can see, they're very different companies. The B Corp certification allows you to excel in certain areas. You don't have to be good at doing the same thing. For example, Patagonia have really led in their positive environmental practice and focus. They donate 1% of their annual profits towards environmental causes. But Ben & Jerry's are more of a worker focus, so they actively employ people who have been in prison and struggle to find employment. So yeah, there's just a variety of companies for you to look at. It's also probably important to note that Danone, only 30% of the business has been B Corp certified. So it's a huge, huge business and it's on its way. So now I just want to talk about what can be taken away from this and how it can be applied to our lives. So at a personal level, Christians have a responsibility to confront injustices that are evident in most companies or their supply chains. If we are to love our neighbour, Christians need to acknowledge our connections to people through globalization, and loving them means catering for their interest. In the Western world, we hold power and responsibility to spend our money in a way that will empower people and protect the environment. This seems really logical, but it's actually so hard to live out in practice. Most companies are reliant on external businesses and workers to make their business possible. And the larger the company is, the more complex the web of operations. Globalization has made it hard for companies to even measure their positive and negative impacts, which makes supporting a movement like B Corp that measure companies' impact so crucial to social and environmental progress. As consumers, we should be informed through things like articles, apps, even ethical influencers that will help us navigate the world in which we live in that makes it really hard to know what is good and what is bad. And yeah, hopefully they can help us buy products and services that are actually making a difference in the world. There are also other movements that individuals could be part of, which help further the mission of B Corps. So for example, there's the Build Back Better movement, which want to take the opportunity that the pandemic has presented to prioritize people, invest in the NHS, and create a resilient economy that is capable of tackling the climate crisis. In building consumer pressure for more ethical and sustainable products and services, the hope would be that companies will conform to the consumer's will in order to continue to attract finance. And this is something that we're already seeing, but the problem that has arisen from this consumer pressure is greenwashing. And this effectively means that people need to be even more informed and alert to clever advertising. In addition, these conscious behaviours should be emulated by Christian leaders who could use their position to influence people to support movements like B Corp and promote relational values found in the Relational Business Charter. In the UK, individuals should also lobby their MPs through emails and letters asking them to incorporate stronger laws and regulation so that companies must take more responsibility in recording and improving their social and environmental impacts. So in America, shareholder primacy is viewed by both parties as the cancer that's killing American competitiveness, American communities, and American workers. And I would hope that in the UK, this could also be a bipartisan issue. For this to happen, individuals, networks, and constituencies need to generate the momentum to attract attention to the issue. From the policy level, government should make it mandatory for businesses to be held accountable for their negative impacts on people and the environment. For this to be possible, the issue that companies are often unaware of their external impacts needs addressing. Therefore, the government should prioritise passing laws that ensure all companies use a standardised impact measure, like the BIA. I would hope that as the BIA develops, it incorporates a relational angle to use as a tool in furthering B-Lab's goals. This would be an important contribution that could be offered by Christians mobilised through the church. If support for these changes is fostered at each level, then this movement stands a chance at dismantling the dominance of shareholder primacy. The time is right for change. Evidence of the environmental and social damage that various business practices are linked to is piling up, and the effects of COVID-19 has accelerated public acceptance that these practices are unsustainable. The collective Christian voice and leadership appears to be lacking from the discussion of change. Despite having resources like the Relational Business Charter, which offers practical principles for companies to follow, founded in Christian thought. Christians should support B Corp's mission to reshape the purpose of business and acknowledge the need to engage with systems and not just personal practices. The B Corp movement is by no means perfect, but as it continues to improve, I would suggest that Christians use their voice to influence these improvements so that relationships can also be prioritised. The new normal in the business sector should only see companies considering themselves successful if they are profitable without compromising the environment or people in the process. This will require a fundamental shift in practices so that businesses' externalities are internalised.